now we cross over to our Oh Soo-young for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Morgan. It is indeed time for Global Insight. The Joe Biden administration has decided to leave open the option to use nuclear weapons, not only in the event of a nuclear attack, but also to deter non-nuclear threats. And this comes as a surprise of varying degrees to those who were expecting President Biden to adopt a no first-use policy based on his position in 2020 that nuclear weapons should only be used in response to nuclear attacks. The decision was made amid the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. And while US media has reported in recent days that discussions in Washington regarding the threat of a nuclear exchange is no longer theoretical. We discussed America's position on the use of its nuclear weapons, and for this I'm joined by Professor Kim Jae-chun, Dean of Seoul University's Graduate School of International Studies. We also have Patty Jane Geller, Policy Analyst on Nuclear Deterrence and Missile Defense at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you both so much for joining us today. And, well, to begin with you, Professor Kim. Now, you were anticipating this nuclear posture review for quite some time, and while we haven't seen the full details yet, what were you expecting to see? And were you surprised that the Biden administration decided not to adopt a no first-use policy?
No, Soo-young, I wasn't surprised at all by the Biden administration's decision. I think it was November last year. There was a report that the Biden administration might adopt no first-use principle in its nuclear posture review. And when that report came out, American allies reacted quite negatively because many American allies rely on American nuclear deterrence, instead of developing their own nuclear weapons. And, we are faced with not just North Korea's nuclear threats, but also threats of other weapons of mass destruction, such as biochemical weapons. So to say that the U.S. will use nuclear weapons only when the U.S. and U.S. allies were attacked by nuclear weapons could weaken American extended deterrence. So American allies lodged complaints, and there was a sign that the Biden administration would drop no first-use principle in NPL, but instead the Biden administration hinted that it could adopt sole purpose principle. Sole purpose principle is that the U.S. would use American nuclear weapons when there is a nuclear threats or attacks, not just attacks. Anyways, the Biden administration decided not to include that even that sole purpose principle and to maintain strategic ambiguity about the usage of American nuclear weapons. And it's quite understandable, I think, given the deteriorating security environment in the world.
Yes, certainly the security environment in the world has been deteriorating. The level of threat has been growing. And Ms. Geller, now, Mr. Biden previously showed support for a no first-use policy. How do you think the Russian war, the Ukrainian war, was factored into the decision?
Yeah, so U.S. nuclear policy must reflect the threats that we're facing in the world around us. And in Russia, we're clearly seeing Russia wreaking havoc on Ukraine. It's rattling its nuclear saber rattle in Europe, conducting nuclear exercises, issuing nuclear threats against the West should they intervene on Ukraine's behalf. Russia is expanding its nuclear arsenal, not only adding in number, but developing new novel nuclear capabilities, like an unmanned underwater drone 7,000 times more powerful than the bomb the U.S. dropped on Japan in World War II. And it's reportedly considering using chemical weapons in Ukraine. Now is clearly not the time to adopt a no first use policy, and I'm relieved that the Biden administration saw that. To me, it was an easy decision. Declaring that we would never use nuclear weapons first would only assure Russia and our other adversaries that they are free to wage the most destructive non-nuclear attacks, chemical, biological, conventional, without having to worry about a U.S. nuclear response. This is particularly worrying if Russia were to expand its invasion into a NATO state. And we said that we wouldn't use nuclear weapons first. That just tells Russia it can pursue aggression so long as it remains just below the nuclear threshold. So clearly, this policy isn't a good idea to pursue at the time. And I don't think no first use should have been on the table in the first place, given the state of the world that we're seeing today. The United States, this is a time when the United States needs to be doing all it can to reassure our allies, deter our adversaries, strengthen our nuclear capabilities, not the other way around.
And Professor Kim, with the US keeping its nuclear options open, what message do you think this decision sends to Moscow amid the war in Ukraine? Do you think it might heighten the risk of a nuclear conflict?
Well, as Ms. Geller just said, the Biden administration already sent a very strong message to Moscow when Moscow issued a nuclear threat over Ukraine. President Biden said a number of times that the U.S. would not participate in Ukraine war directly. However, if you ever use nuclear weapons, we'll be directly involved. We don't care what kinds of nuclear weapons you use. You say you'd use these small nuclear weapons with the low yield and less fallout, we don't care. We'll be directly involved. I think that's the message that the Biden administration already imparted to Moscow. And I think it was a good thing that the Biden administration sent this strong message to Putin. Well, I don't think these stern messages will heighten the risk of nuclear conflict. Rather, I think it'll disincentivize Putin and then prevent Putin from using nuclear weapons. I think appeasement policy is the worst policy you can use against these dictators. You should never appease these dictators on their nuclear threats. That, I think, is the worst policy.
Ms. Geller, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Given the threats that we're seeing around the world, declaring a no first use policy would only show that the United States is backing down. It would in no way rejecting that policy would in no way provoke Russia. We've seen during the war and time after time again in history that it's U.S. strength is that deters Russian aggression, and I think that's what we need to focus on seeing from the Biden administration. And I do have to point out and make clear, while Biden did reject a no first use policy, the declaratory policy he did adopt still weakens the role of our nuclear weapons. He adopted a fundamental role policy that says the fundamental role of our nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attacks. It de-emphasizes the role that our nuclear weapons play in deterring non-nuclear attacks. And while it doesn't rule the use of nuclear weapons against chemical, biological attacks completely, it's still de-emphasizing that role. And I don't think the Biden administration should be doing anything that telegraphs weakness. We need to show strength in order to show Putin that the United States will not tolerate the use of nuclear weapons or further aggression into a NATO state.
And Ms. Geller, well, there still have been some complaints, some concerns about not adopting a no first use policy. But what would such a policy entail for America's allies?
Yeah, so the United States upholds its important commitment to extend its nuclear umbrella over about 30 treaty allies, and a no first use policy would put those extended deterrence commitments at risk. If we said we'd never use nuclear weapons first, then that leaves a gap in our extended deterrence of strategic non-nuclear attacks, chemical, biological. And our allies find this no first use policy so unnerving because they're the ones who are at greatest risk of such non-nuclear attacks. And that's because compared to the United States, our allies are on the front lines of conflict with Russia, China, North Korea. Obviously we're seeing that in the Ukraine war currently. So taking U.S. nuclear weapons off the table might make allies hesitant that the United States would extend their deterrence in the case of a non-nuclear attack. And if our allies don't feel assured, then they might feel compelled to acquire their own nuclear weapons, which would go against long-standing U.S. commitments to non-proliferation. So again, as I've been saying, now is the time the United States needs to do all it can to reassure its allies, especially as there's a war waging on just NATO's very borders.
And Professor Kim, well, how did allies like those in Seoul and Tokyo feel about the possibility of Washington adopting a no first use policy?
Well, as I said, when the report came out in November last year, a report that the Biden administration would adopt no first use principle policy wasn't really well received by South Korea and also by Japan because both countries rely very heavily on American nuclear deterrence to deter North Korea and also to deter China and Russia. I mean, we talk mostly about the importance of deterring North Koreans, but I think it's also important to have deterrence capability against China and Russia, given the escalating tension between liberal countries and autocratic countries. You know, Soo-young, no first use is a noble cause, so is sole purpose principle. There is no denying that. I mean, if all these 5 nuclear weapons countries can somehow adopt no first use principle and abide by it, that'll strengthen international nuclear non-proliferation regime. There is no denying that. But Russia is issuing nuclear threats. China has no first use policy, only in name, and the U.S. has some 20 allies that depend on American nuclear deterrence, in which case the U.S. has no option but to maintain ambiguity on its nuclear policy.
And Professor Kim, South Korea's incoming president, Yoon Suk-yeol, he said that he aims to strengthen South Korea and the US's security ties. And of course, South Korea's long relied on America's nuclear umbrella. His team said that it's looking into reactivating the extended deterrence policy. Now, what does that mean?
There is very little doubt that Yoon Suk-yeol government will strengthen South Korea's security ties with the United States. In that context, Yoon will try to strengthen the U.S. extended deterrence, of course, in close consultation with the Biden administration. You know, we are faced with ever-increasing threats of North Korea's nuclear weapons and missiles, and we don't have our own nuclear deterrent capability. So credibility of the American extended deterrence is very important. I'm not saying that American extended deterrence is not credible. I think South Korea and the United States have put a good faith efforts to strengthen extended deterrence. But you
Oh, Professor Kim, I think the connection went a bit funny there. I'm so sorry, but could you repeat that last sentence?
Oh, I think many Koreans are saying that, you know, what are the specific mechanisms with which extended deterrence operates, and are we really being properly consulted in these matters? So in 2016, South Korea and the United States agreed to establish what is known as Extended Deterrence Strategy and Consultation Group to discuss all these matters, you know, to discuss how we can make extended deterrence more credible. But this group, this consultation group, met only twice. And since then, it has been pretty much inactive. So Yoon wants to reactivate this consultation mechanism, this group, and discuss a variety of ways in which we can upgrade American extended deterrence and also to enhance credibility of.
I see. And Ms. Gallo, well, do you expect President Joe Biden to continue pursuing a reduced role for nuclear weapons in America's strategy? Where does America stand right now in terms of particularly Moscow's arsenal of more than 2,000 nuclear weapons, as you mentioned in your recent commentary?
Yeah, great question. So the Biden administration's top priority should be deterring nuclear threats, but unfortunately we are seeing a further attempt to continue reducing the role of U.S. nuclear weapons. The budget request for the upcoming fiscal year was announced last week, and in that request, the Biden administration is canceling a nuclear capability currently under development that would deter Russia's arsenal of tactical nuclear weapons. This weapon is called the Nuclear Sea-Launched Cruise Missile, and it was proposed in 2018 by the Trump administration for the very purpose of deterring Russian use of nuclear weapons in Europe, which is the very scenario that we're worried about today with the war in Ukraine. You mentioned Russia's arsenal of over 2,000 tactical weapons, which I'd love to explain. When it comes to strategic nuclear weapons, those that can reach each other's homelands like a long-range missile, the U.S. and Russia have about parity from the New START treaty. But then there's a category of low-yield tactical weapons that are smaller in explosive power, shorter in range, that are meant for use on the battlefield. Russia has over 2,000 of these weapons and outnumbers the U.S. in this category by at least 10 to 1. And this nuclear capability, the sea-launched cruise missile that Biden is canceling, would have started to rectify this disparity between U.S. and Russian capabilities. So I don't understand the reason of reducing the role of our nuclear weapons by canceling nuclear capabilities at a time when Russia is threatening the use of nuclear weapons. We're also, by reducing the role of our nuclear weapons, we're sending a dangerous signal that Putin's nuclear threats are working and that the United States is backing down. So given that budget request, I hope now that Congress will work to refund this critical nuclear capability and continue to fund the U.S. nuclear modernization efforts. It's more critical than ever that we are prioritizing a strong nuclear deterrence over any other goals, like reducing the role.
That was Professor Kim Jae-chun, Dean of Seoul University's Graduate School of International Studies, and Patty Jane Geller, Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you again so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Very much.